Warm greetings, everyone. My name is Dorothy Guerrero, and welcome to Global Justice Now's interview series, Southern Perspectives on the Coronavirus Pandemic. COVID-19 is still spreading. Lockdowns at various degrees around the world disrupted global and national supply chains of essential goods and services. The World Bank warned in June that the pandemic would push up to 60 million people into extreme poverty this year. The lockdowns are getting lifted, but the health issues remain, and the global forecast about the economic impacts of the pandemic is simply grim. We started this informational and educational interview series to present internationalist viewpoints on how COVID-19 is playing out in different societies and to highlight the visions and alternatives from social movements in the global south. Through this, we hope to get a first-hand understanding of the possibilities being shaped from social activism and the progressive processes they are building. In this interview, our focus is Mexico. The forecast is that COVID-19 could result to around 10 million job losses, which will increase the number of people below the level of poverty. We have Peter Rossett to tell us what is happening there and share his analysis on the links between COVID-19, trade, and other economic justice issues. Peter is a professor at Ecosur Advanced Studies Institute in Chiapas, Mexico, as well as a former staff and current advisor to the Via Campesina. So he covers Latin America, Mexico, Brazil, and Cuba. So hello, Peter, how are you?
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm actually in Brazil right now, although normally I'm based in Mexico, so it's great to be talking.
Mm-hmm. And you told me before that you're making this interview on the hotel lobby. That's why you're wearing the mask, which is
exactly.
a very responsible thing to do. So I hope you keep well while you're staying there. Yeah. So, the figures about the rate of infection and death in Mexico are quite disturbing. And in the past months, the government seems to be on denial about it. So are they still in that stage? What is happening? What is the situation in Mexico concerning the spread of the virus? Can you tell us more, please?
Well, I think there's both bad news and good news in terms of the spread of the virus. And yes, the government is definitely in denial because the official story that we get from the government through the news media in Mexico is that Mexico is an international success story. It's an international success story because no measures from the federal government were obligatory. Everything was recommendations and voluntary. And yet they claimed that they were able to not have saturation of intensive care units and hospitals. However, that message is a little bit contradicted by the data on deaths. If we compare, for example, Brazil, which is widely recognized as an international failure with its neo-fascist president Bolsonaro, Brazil has a little over 200 million people and has around 80,000 COVID deaths. Mexico is approximately half the size, around 100 million and almost 40,000 deaths. So in fact, if you look at the rate of death, registered, reported death per population, Mexico is in fact just as bad as Brazil. On the other hand, I did say there was some good news, and that would be that it appears that the curve is leveling in Mexico, whereas in Brazil it's continuing with an exponential rate of increase. Nevertheless, to have so many deaths in Mexico, I don't think there's any way to call that a success. And so there's definitely a lot of denial going on, especially when we look at some countries in Latin America that manage the virus very well, for example, Cuba and Venezuela, as well as countries that appeared to be managing it very well, like Argentina, until they prematurely relaxed measures and are now confronting an increase of the virus. So Mexico is really not a success story, although the official message is that it is.
And how are the different sectors or layers of society being affected or impacted? Is it just in the capital, or is it also in the rural areas?
I think like in many countries, it started in the capital and it started in middle-class neighborhoods because of international travel. And I have a theory at a global level that governments in general, with the possible exception of socialist countries, imposed the most strict measures when the virus peak was in middle-class neighborhoods or upper middle-class neighborhoods. And as the geographical wave moved, those neighborhoods, the curve leveled and then began to drop, and then the curve next began to explode in popular neighborhoods, slums, the urban periphery, favelas. Then government started to relax the measures, and then even more so as the waves rolled out into the countryside in indigenous and peasant territories where there are no health clinics, no testing carried out. That's when measures are almost completely relaxed in Mexico, but in most countries. And so we have a invisible explosion of pandemic in rural areas where in indigenous people and peasant communities. And so that's the reality that I perceive in Mexico, but also in most countries. And I think it's classism and racism blended together in what we in Latin America call necropolitics. Let's do ethnic cleansing, poverty cleansing, let the virus do the job so state repression doesn't have to do it, reduce the burden of poor people on public sector budgets, and pretend that we were a success because the middle class was saved.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned about the budget. Various governments are putting up different stimulus package, and Mexico also did the same. Can you tell us who's benefiting more?
Well,
Our
in fact,
reading is that it's more bailout for corporations. So
I would say that Mexico has not done any significant stimulus package. It's all been trivial compared to gross domestic product compared to the international debt, because one of the pillars of the president's policy position, López Obrador, is what he calls Republican austerity. It's like some kind of a weird Protestant ethic or evangelical idea that he has, that you should never spend any money and you should never go into debt. And in fact, economists from the left to the right, except for the Chicago boys, are saying that the economic crisis being produced by the pandemic in all countries requires massive public sector spending and a Keynesian stimulus package, which those of us on the left prefer go to poor people. Those on the right say you should go to industry and the private sector, but all agree that it's a time for increased public spending. And in fact, the correct position would be debt be damned. Even if a country has to get into deeper debt, none of us seriously think any country is going to ever really pay off its debt. So 1% more, 1% less is nothing compared to the impact on the size of the crisis that we're coming into. And so therefore, I feel that López Obrador is making a huge mistake. He and Bolsonaro in Brazil, despite having apparently opposed political ideologies, are both mismanaging the virus and mismanaging the economic stimulus by essentially being stingy and sticking to reduction of the primary deficit kind of theory that was pushed by the IMF in the 1980s and by the Chicago boys at exactly the worst possible moment. So I fear that Mexico is going to go into an unbelievably deep economic depression due to the lack of stimulus and, in fact, very little support for poor people. One of the reasons why I think there's so much death is that people are asked to stay home voluntarily, but there's no economic support for them to do so. And so unlike countries like Venezuela or Argentina, who are guaranteeing wages and suspending rent, Mexico has done nothing like that. And so of course people have to go out and work in order to survive. And no measures work, in my opinion, if they're not both obligatory and also include economic support for working people so that they can essentially economically stay home.
Yeah, well, I wanted to go now on this issue of well, the fact that the new U.S., Mexico, Canada took effect in July 1, and one of your officials, or one of the former negotiator even, describe it as the light at the end of the tunnel. So how will this new free trade agreement counter the risk, the economic risk given or brought by the pandemic?
Well, it's only going to make it worse, as trade liberalization always does. It certainly makes economic conditions worse for working people, and And just as NAFTA made things worse for working people in Mexico, the United States, and Canada, the new agreement, which is called T-MEC, is going to make things even worse for people in the same three countries. So for example, if we talk about the peasant sector in Mexico, who produce maize as the principal product, the large maize or corn producers in the United States, who are corporations and not individuals, exporters, were able to heavily influence the negotiations for the new treaty and make the trade liberalization in agricultural products even worse, which is only going to accentuate what's causing massive rural-urban migration and economic collapse in rural areas in Mexico for the last 3 decades, which is dumping of cheap maize and other agricultural products by US corporations at below the cost of production in Mexico. So it's the worst possible time for an even worse free trade agreement.
Yeah, and also what was inserted in the agreement as well is that for Mexico to benefit from the trade deal, you need to pay something so that you can get jobs from the US, which seems to be good for US workers, or a good idea if it's set at the right rate, but it could prevent offshoring. But
Yeah.
what will that give to Mexico? What do you think?
Basically nothing. Like all trade agreements, they're dressed up with supposed clauses for labor rights, for environmental protection, which are mostly nonsense and are non-enforceable. And so their real function is to enable bad agreements to be approved. They reduce opposition. It's like social containment. And so the treaties get approved, and then these clauses are useless. So I don't see U.S. workers or Mexican workers or Mexican farmers or U.S. farmers or Canadian farmers getting any benefits at all. The transnational corporations based in the 3 countries will be the beneficiaries, as has always been the case with these trade agreements. Now, the United States threatened Mexico with a unilateral increase in tariffs of 5% if Mexico didn't enter into negotiations for the agreement. And many of us in Mexico said, well, hey, that would be great, because that would reduce the incentive to engage in export production, and would increase the incentive to produce for the national economy, and that would actually be a benefit for poor and working people and local businesses in Mexico. But the government said, oh, well, that's such pressure that we had no choice. We had to go into the agreement. And now the supposedly left government is singing about how it's a great victory for Mexico that an even worse free trade agreement has been signed with the United States and Canada.
Mm-hmm. Well, before, during the lockdown, there are limits to mobility and organizing, and now with the lifting of the lockdown, during the lockdown, did it change how the Via Campesina do its organizing, its mobilizing? And at the same time, the link question to that is there a platform or initiative how the various groups that are not in agreement with what the government is doing, are they putting their agendas together to counter the bad things happening at the moment, and imagine what will be a post-pandemic Mexico look like?
Well, I think the first thing is important to say is that the Mexican federal government didn't really do any lockdowns. It left that to municipal or state level governments, which I think is one of the reasons why there's so many deaths in Mexico, that there were hardly any obligatory measures taken by the federal government. In my opinion, they abdicated their responsibility. Now, what's happening in the peasant movement is very interesting. I could say that in the elections, when López Obrador was elected, there was a huge split on the left amongst peasant and indigenous peoples movements, some supporting the campaign of López Obrador, thinking that he would be a progressive breath of fresh air and would restore all kinds of economic supports for the countryside that had been cut by previous neoliberal governments, versus a strong sector, especially indigenous people, who saw him as a fake progressive who was really going to implement neoliberalism with some kind of assistentialist social programs for social containment, but was really going to advance in the neoliberal and the capitalist project for Mexico. At this point, there aren't any differences because the new government completely ignored the peasant movement that supported the electoral campaign. In fact, announced that they would give no more government funds in any form to any kind of peasant organization, that all aid would be individualized and given directly to people in the form of handouts in the countryside, direct cash transfers, which is the single most demobilizing policy that governments can use against social movements. And so I hate to use language like this, but the government has just shit on top of the movements that work to bring out the vote for them. So at this point, you won't find hardly anybody in rural Mexico with anything good to say about the government. They see it as more of the same. And in addition to that, the major signature programs are mega projects creating dispossession and evictions in the countryside. The Mayan train and the corridor, the Transismic corridor, which is essentially a dry canal to supplement the Panama Canal, and is going to have massive devastation in rural areas with all kinds of maquiladora, industrial zones, wind energy generation parks, mining concessions. And so it's basically turned the whole peasant and indigenous movement against the government and into a phase of resistance. And in that, and the pandemic has been interesting because it revealed both the weakness of rural areas, but also strengths that had been made invisible. Amongst the weaknesses were the fact that that peasants were not anymore producing all of their food. They were producing some of their food, but mostly commercial crops, and then consuming food brought in by trucks from agribusiness. That stopped when highways and logistics collapsed, and they were thrown back onto their own devices, and has led to a new appreciation and emphasis on self-sufficiency and autonomy in terms of food production in rural areas. So it also made people remember the strength was that they could produce all of the food that they needed. And so people have been rushing to plant all kinds of short cycle crops and short lifespan livestock in order to produce their own food. The same with healthcare. They were dependent on government health clinics that basically didn't exist in rural areas, and to the extent that they existed, they were only staffed by doctors doing their obligatory 2-year social service after graduating from medical school, all of whom were withdrawn as soon as the pandemic started. And so rural areas were abandoned in terms of healthcare, but rediscovered all kinds of traditional medicine, including things which appear to be quite effective for treating COVID symptoms. So to make a long story short, peasant and indigenous communities and movements have discovered that they have a whole range of strengths in terms of self-governance, food production, medicine, recovering collective identity. And I think that that's going to be lead to, or it's already leading to, a major rethinking of the whole concept of territories and how we self-govern our territories, which is now taking place in a series of internal, private, virtual debates amongst peasant and indigenous movements in Via Campesina, Mexico. So, you know, it's like every cloud has a silver lining, you could say. I think something positive is coming for rural social movements out of this very terrible situation.
Yeah, that sounds very, very inspiring indeed. And I think you're in the best position to respond to my next question, given your close relationship with various social movements in Latin America. A few years ago, people are writing about the end of the pink tide and raising the question, what's now for the left in Latin America? So what now for the left of Latin America? How is it? How's the social movement situation in the region? What's next, or what's at this point for regional solidarity and global solidarity?
I mean, I think not only is the pink tide over, but we have the fascist tide rising throughout the region. And my personal opinion, which is a controversial one, is that it was precisely the failure of the so-called progressive governments to address any kind of real structural change or structural reforms, and only do cosmetic social assistance cash transfer programs while presiding over a whole package of neoliberal policies, including the transnationalization of most of the economies presided over by so-called left governments. So what happened, for example, in South America a few years ago is essentially we see what's happening in Mexico now. And it was those failures in South America that essentially led to the rise of the right. Not only were, instead of taking advantage of anti-globalization and anti-neoliberal sentiment amongst the masses, they continued to preside over governments that were with neoliberal policies. And it was the right who was able to capitalize on people's discontent by pointing out the many failures of these so-called left governments and build a social base now for the rise of fascism. And essentially, if we take, for example, Brazil as the paradigm, not the only country, but the paradigm, the electoral party left has essentially fallen off the table. They're not on the chessboard anymore. The dispute is between different sectors of the right, the so-called civilized right versus the fascist right. And the left doesn't even appear hardly at all anymore in newspapers or in public opinion. And they lost most of their mobilization capacity because they got dragged into petty electoral politics and government financed projects, which totally demobilized their base, along with the direct transfer programs. Because when people get direct cash transfer, they don't go to a union meeting or a peasant organization meeting. It's very dismobilizing. The whole cash transfer thing done with plastic debit cards led one analyst to say that that for social movements in Latin America, plastic bullets have proven to be more deadly than lead bullets. That the cash transfer bullet to demobilize movements was very effective. And that means when fascism really became a threat, who could mobilize in the streets against fascists would be social movements, but they lost most of their mobilization capacity during the years of the so-called friendly governments. And they also sucked energy into electoral politics as opposed to social grassroots mobilization politics. And so the left as a whole, uniquely unprepared to have any kind of response to the rise of fascism. And that's the sad situation in South America. And we're seeing the same film being repeated a few years later in Mexico. And nobody in the governing party, which claims to be left but isn't left, wants to hear that we've already seen that film, and we know how it ends, and it doesn't have a happy ending.
Well, those are very good points in the current rethinking of where to, what next for the progressives and the left, especially in the region. So any last point you wanted to share?
Yes, I think that this is the lead line from an article that I'm writing with another colleague, but we say that there's a specter haunting Latin America, and it's the specter of autonomy, and that autonomy is the key debate that social movements have been perhaps avoiding, except for the indigenous people's social movements. But given the current situation, has to be the debate that we put in the center of the table, because if the left, electorally speaking, can't challenge the dispute between different factions of the right, what we can do is build strength in our own territories, especially rural movements, but also slum dwellers movements, model a different society in those territories, and build strength to be able to challenge power more effectively from a strong base and not from a weak base, because basically the base was weakened by electoral politics. Now we need to strengthen the base with autonomy politics, not autonomy in the sense of Eurocentric traditions of anarchism, but autonomy in the sense of other ontologies and epistemologies coming from indigenous people in Latin America, where we could hold up the Zapatista autonomous territory as the paradigm of this other way of thinking and governing ourselves on our own territories.
Well, that's very promising, and I'm excited to know and hear from you about that more in the future. And yeah, it's really good and positive and uplifting to hear from you today. Thank you very much, Peter, and
Yes.
Take care. And yeah, we hope to read more of your thoughts and hear more about your ideas later. Bye-bye.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Bye-bye.